Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at spiritual groups, cults, and that murky area in between.
Yeah.
And you guys have given us a lot to look at today. We have some academic studies on how cults work. We have
Mm.
personal stories from people who left a particular group,
Right?
and we even have an alleged list of cult members from a watchdog site.
Yeah. It is quite a mixed bag.
It is. So
Mm.
our mission, if you will, is to help you, the listener, understand how these groups work,
Mhm.
how to think critically about their leaders and teachings, and really, at the end of the day, how to stay safe. But I
Right.
think before we get into any specifics, we have to define what exactly we're talking about. What makes a group a cult? I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, it does. And it's often used, I think, with very little nuance. One of the sources you provided, cult101.pdf, lays out some really interesting expert insights and, key characteristic of a cult, something called coercive persuasion. And you can think of this as a systematic type of manipulation that slowly chips away at a person's ability to think for themselves.
So not outright brainwashing, but more insidious.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's more about subtle influence, like Robert J. Lifton's concept of thought reform. So you can imagine constantly being exposed to a certain idea.
Ugh.
Even if it's presented subtly over time, it starts to feel normal,
Yeah.
even if it goes against your initial beliefs.
Yeah.
That's thought reform in action.
Okay.
And another hallmark of a cult is the presence of a charismatic leader, someone who inspires intense devotion, sometimes obedience from their followers.
Okay. So is it always about, malicious intent on the leader's part?
Right.
Or could some leaders genuinely believe that they have all the answers?
That is a very fascinating question. It's a very complex question to answer.
Mhm.
Often these leaders are portrayed as almost godlike figures.
Right.
But, regardless of their intent, the impact on their followers can be quite significant, especially when you factor in the isolation from outside influences that many cults encourage. It creates this kind of us versus them mentality.
It's like they create their own reality bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings up this really important point from cults deteriorated spiritual systems.pdf, which is that, even groups that start with good intentions
Mm-hmm.
can become corrupted over time.
That's kind of a sobering thought. So it's not always about a leader having this master plan from day one.
Right. This source uses this analogy of fossilization.
Mhm.
You can think about a living organism becoming a rigid fossil.
Okay.
Teachings that were once very dynamic and evolving can harden into dogma, stifling critical thinking and personal growth. And that brings us to a specific group that many of the sources focus on, the Science of Identity Foundation, or SIF.
Okay, now this connection to SIF has me very intrigued. What does the source material say about their leader, Chris Butler, also known as Jagadguru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa?
Well, first, does that name ring a bell for you at all?
Ah.
Especially if you followed the career of a certain prominent political figure, Tulsi Gabbard?
Right, okay.
But we'll come back to that connection a bit later.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that for now. So let's dive into SIF. What are some of the red flags that the sources are raising about this organization?
Well, XA Members Post 0182.pdf points out some pretty stark contradictions between what SIF teaches and traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the branch of Hinduism that they claim to represent.
Okay.
And one example that really stood out to me was their emphasis on Hatha Yoga as a recruitment tool.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that Hatha Yoga is inherently problematic or anything like that,
Right.
but it's atypical for this particular lineage to use it so prominently to draw people in.
That's a good point. It's almost like they're using it as a gateway and then layering these other beliefs on top of it.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret
Yeah.
it. And then there are these allegations of financial impropriety within SIF, detailed in Czaitanii mission, Polish at PDF. And there are claims that SIF properties were sold and the funds just vanished.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation. It makes you wonder where that money went and who benefited.
Yeah, speaking of potential red flags, this financial issue ties into a larger pattern that we see in cults: exploitation and control. And in traumabusecults.pdf, it's highlighted that a charismatic leader can create this so-called program of purification that's actually designed to manipulate and control their followers.
I can see how that would be effective. Making followers feel like they need the leader to be cleansed or to be saved.
Exactly. And it becomes even more concerning when you consider the connection to Joseph Bismarck, also known as Japa Das. He's a high-ranking SEF member and a key figure in that controversial multi-level marketing company, QNet.
Oh, QNet. Now that's a name that's been associated with some questionable business practices, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it has. And the information in Joseph Bismarck Poznana 193.pdf kind of suggests this link between SUF and a business model that's been accused of being predatory and exploitative.
So we're starting to see a pattern here with SIF, potential deviations from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, maybe even some cult-like behaviors.
Yeah.
But you mentioned this concept of spiritual lineage or parampara earlier. That's a pretty big deal in this tradition, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Keeping Faith with Katuri.pdf explains that parampara refers to this transmission of spiritual knowledge from teacher to student, stretching back centuries.
Okay.
It's really seen as like the lifeblood of authentic spiritual practice in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
That's a beautiful concept. But, I can also see how that concept could be used to silence dissent or to, shut down critical thinking. Have you seen examples of that?
That's a very astute observation. The potential for misuse definitely exists.
Hmm.
And when you consider the concerns that we've been talking about with SIF, it does raise questions about their adherence to parampara.
Mm.
Critics argue that their practices and teachings don't really align with the traditional understanding of spiritual lineage,
Mm-hmm.
casting doubt on the authenticity of their lineage.
Okay, so how do we reconcile these conflicting pieces of information? Seth claims to be part of this ancient lineage, but there are also these concerns about their practices and their leaders' behavior. What questions should we be asking ourselves when we encounter any spiritual group or leader making these kinds of claims?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that every individual really has to grapple with on their own. There's no easy answer,
And,
no one-size-fits-all test. But this is where those personal accounts that you provided become incredibly valuable.
because they offer that inside perspective.
Exactly, yeah. And XMAV members, postsidra182.pdf, former SIF members describe feeling manipulated, controlled, even exploited. They talk about the pressure to conform, to surrender their autonomy, to prioritize the group's needs above their own.
That's really heartbreaking, especially when you think about people joining these groups seeking spiritual guidance and a sense of community. It's a stark reminder that, not all spiritual paths are created equal.
Yeah, and that's why understanding these psychological dynamics at play is so crucial. Charismatic leaders can be incredibly persuasive, tapping into our deep-seated desires for belonging, for purpose, for transcendence.
So it's not always about a leader being deliberately malicious, but maybe more about them having this distorted view of reality themselves.
That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to look at the leader's actions and the group's practices as a whole. TraumaBeesCults.pdf talks about how cult leaders often create this environment of fear and dependency.
Okay.
They might use guilt, shames, even threats to keep followers in line.
And that can make it incredibly difficult to leave even when you start to have doubts.
Absolutely. Cult environments often isolate members from their outside support systems, making it even harder to break free. But it's important to remember that people do leave cults, and there are resources available to help them heal and rebuild their lives.
Okay, so we've talked about the red flags, the psychological tactics, but what can we do to protect ourselves? How do we develop that healthy skepticism without becoming completely cynical or distrustful of everyone?
Yeah, that's the balancing act, isn't it? It starts with education, like what we're doing right now. The more you understand about how these groups operate, the better equipped you'll be to spot potential warning signs.
So knowledge is really power in this case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another crucial part of that is trusting your intuition. If something feels off, if a group's teachings or practices seem extreme or make you uncomfortable, don't ignore those feelings,
Even if everyone else seems to be buying into it.
especially then. Remember, cults thrive on conformity and silencing dissent.
You mentioned earlier that Joseph Bismarck Japata 0z0193.pdf highlighted some concerning things about QNet. What advice would you give to someone considering joining a multi-level marketing company or any organization where recruitment is heavily emphasized?
That's a great question. My first piece of advice would be to do your research thoroughly. Don't just rely on what the recruiters are telling you. Look for independent sources of information. Investigate the company's track record. Talk to people who have actually been involved.
Be wary of promises of easy money or quick success.
Absolutely. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Legitimate businesses are built on hard work, not on recruiting endless chains of people.
Right.
And be especially cautious if you're asked to pay like a large sum of money up front or to recruit others as a primary focus.
Those are some classic red flags, right?
They are,
Yeah.
yeah. If you encounter them, proceed with extreme caution.
Okay.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more informed you are, the less vulnerable you'll be to manipulation and exploitation.
Now, going back to Tulsi Gabbard for a second, I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of her situation. She's been accused of being a cult member, but she's also a very successful politician who's advocated for some progressive causes.
It's a good reminder that individuals are very multifaceted and we can't really reduce them to a single label.
Yeah, and we should be really careful about making assumptions about someone's beliefs or motivations based solely on their affiliation with a particular group.
Right. Our goal here is to help you develop critical thinking skills, not to judge or condemn individuals.
And I think all this talk about SIF and their potential deviation from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism leads us back to that key question. How can we tell the difference between genuine spiritual seeking and potential cult involvement?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries, and it's one that we'll continue to explore as we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, so we're back for the final part in our deep dive into spiritual groups and cults. And after all this talk about SIF and thought reform and parampara, it really makes you think twice about where you place your trust.
It does. It really highlights the importance of discernment when you say, we've covered a lot of ground, red flags,
Mhm.
psychological manipulation.
Mm.
But that question that really lingers is how to tell the difference between authentic spiritual seeking
Hmm.
and, potential cult involvement.
Right, because as we saw with those personal accounts from XF members, the desire for belonging and spiritual growth can make people really vulnerable. So, how can we cultivate that healthy skepticism without becoming completely jaded?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that healthy spiritual communities encourage critical thinking and individual growth. They don't demand blind obedience or unquestioning loyalty.
So, they're open to questions and doubts. They want their members to think for themselves.
Exactly. Remember that fossilization analogy we talked about from cults and deteriorated spiritual systems.pdf?
Yeah.
True spiritual growth requires an open mind, a willingness to learn and evolve, not blind adherence to rigid dogma. If a group discourages you from asking questions or seeking outside perspectives, that's a huge red flag.
So, it's not just about what the group teaches, but it's also about how they operate, how they treat their members.
Exactly. Another crucial distinction is the emphasis on personal experience versus external authority. Traumabeastcults.pdf
Hmm.
showed how cult leaders often manipulate followers by encouraging them to trust their subjective feelings above all else, even if those feelings are based on misinformation or outright manipulation.
That makes sense. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of a group, especially if you're seeking validation or a sense of belonging.
It is. And that's why healthy spiritual communities encourage a balance between inner experience and external validation. They recognize the importance of critical thinking, discernment, and accountability.
That resonates with me. It's not about blindly following a leader or dismissing all external input, but finding that middle ground where you can trust your intuition while also staying grounded in reality.
Exactly. It's about finding that delicate balance.
Hmm.
And, I think that's a great metaphor for this entire discussion. It's about finding that sweet spot between openness and skepticism, between trust and discernment.
You've given us a lot to consider today. As we wrap up, what's the final message we want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's this. The search for spiritual meaning and belonging is a deeply personal and often challenging journey. There are no easy answers. There are no guaranteed paths to enlightenment. But by cultivating critical thinking, trusting our intuition, and seeking out healthy communities, we can navigate this complex landscape with wisdom and resilience.
That's beautifully said. We've explored some dark and troubling aspects of spiritual seeking today, but you've also reminded us of the potential for growth, connection, and transformation when those needs are met in healthy ways.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to choose their path with awareness and integrity.
Well, knowledge is power, and hopefully this deep dive has equipped our listeners with the knowledge to make informed choices and to protect themselves from potential harm. As always, it's been a pleasure picking your brain.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, stay true to yourselves.